So in terms of its economic system, socialism, Nyerere wanted to approach socialism from a different aspect. And I'll just bring out a few points. One, he thought it would be very risky to align himself solidly with one camp during this era of Cold War struggle, which was being played out in Africa, after he'd already seen what happened in Congo. Later on, he saw what happened in Ghana, where Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown in 1966 in a CIA-supported military coup d'etat. So he wanted a path that would sort of be a middle path. He would not be seen as totally in the Western camp or in the Soviet camp or in the Eastern camp. So that was number one. Number two, he also believed that in Tanzania and perhaps in Africa, socialism could be created without the class struggle, which was, of course, the basis in Marxist analysis. And his argument was this, that since African societies, and Tanzania inclusive, was traditionally communal anyway, that could be used as the basis to create socialism in Africa. So he came out with what he called ujamaa. Ujamaa is the Kiswahili word for familyhood or communalism. So he called it ujamaa or African socialism. And what did this entail? It entailed the creation of collectivized villages, what he called ujamaa villages, throughout the country. And initially, he was impressed with a project that had independently been started in Tanzania called the Ruvuma Project. Ruvuma is a province in Tanzania. So it was called the Ruvuma Development Association, started by a private individual, a Tanzanian by the name of Ntimbanjayo Milinga. And I'll spell it in case anyone wanted to do any further research on this. The first name is Ntimbanjayo. The last name is Milinja. Milinga. And he created a community where some things were collectivized. So the farmers within that community or village would farm their private individual plots, but they will also collectively farm larger plots together collectively. And they would also pool their resources based on the proceeds of what they produced on the land, and created health clinics and created schools. And by using their collective resources, were able to provide collective services that would be much more difficult to attain on an individual level. And Nyerere went and he visited this community, and he was very impressed. Now, Milinga was advised by a British quantity surveyor named Ralph Ibbott, Ibbott, who became a friend, and they collaborated and worked together. And Ibbott was able to help him secure some resources from overseas as well. And Ibbott himself and his family also lived in that community. So Nyerere had the idea to duplicate this setting, what he then called Ujamaa Village, throughout the country, throughout Tanzania. One critical aspect was very different in terms of how Nyerere applied it for the rest of the country. In the Ruvuma Development Association, all the major decisions were based on democratic voting by all the members of the collective. But in the Ujamaa villages, which were multiplied throughout the country, in theory and indeed in practice initially, many of the decisions were also governed based on collective voting and decision making. But then at some point, the ruling party started making many of the decisions. And also in terms of relocating people to these villages, it was under some compulsion, because if other people were moved and you were left alone, obviously you would feel the pressure to also move into the Ujamaa villages. So it's believed that this also led to the disruption of some production in terms of the agricultural produce that the Ujamaa villages became dependent on. And that at some point it affected the quantity of food that was produced. And instead of leading to independence and more abundant production and generation of more revenue by exports, it actually ultimately led to more dependence. That was one aspect in the creation of socialism in Tanzania. The second aspect was in 1967, Nyerere made what he called the Arusha Declaration. And the document is available online, and people can look that out. Arusha is spelled A-R-U-S-H-A, and it's named after a Tanzanian city called Arusha. So the Arusha Declaration was in 1967, and this outlined the ruling party, TANU's and Nyerere's really vision of how socialism could be created in Tanzania. And so what Nyerere did through the Arusha Declaration was to, number one, come out with a code of conduct declaration for the leadership of the country and for the ruling party. So, for example, all the leaders had to declare their assets. They were no longer allowed to own private properties that they was used for rent, for extra income. They were not allowed to sit on the boards, be directors of private corporations. And Nyerere also announced the nationalization of major industries and banks and insurance companies. And one motivation he had was to fight corruption, which he thought and saw was proliferating in many African countries after independence. And that's why he set this really the disciplinary code of conduct for leaders in Tanzania. And he also actually practiced what he preached. So he reduced salaries of public employees, and he cut his own salary by 20%. And his wife, Miriam Nyerere, who had a poultry farm, donated her farm to one of the Ujamaa villages in the country. Now, Nyerere ended up facing tremendous challenges after nationalizing the major industries, because Tanzania did not have sufficient trained, skilled manpower to operate many of these companies. So in the end, many of the companies were operated inefficiently, and obviously that also affected production and productivity. But ultimately, and this was really the undoing of Nyerere's quest to create an independent economic system, or African socialism, in Tanzania. It goes back to what I said in the very beginning. No matter what type of vision you have, when it comes to the implementation, if what you produce, the agricultural products, the mineral resources, sells in the international market for significantly less than what you import, the manufactured industrialized products, it is virtually impossible to build an independent path to economic growth, whether you call it socialism or not, in Africa. And this impacts all the countries that try to build a socialist economy, and it also impacted all the countries that try to pursue the neoliberal Western model. So whether it was Tanzania or whether it was Kenya, they're all impacted by these same conditions of dependent underdevelopment that's been studied and written about since the 1960s by people like the late Raoul Prebisch, by Andre Gunda Frank, and as I mentioned earlier, by Walter Rodney, and by Samir Amin. And then the really breaking point for the case of Tanzania came in 1978, late 1978, when the Ugandan dictator Idi Amin invaded and occupied parts of Tanzania. So Tanzania had to go to war, and it defeated Idi Amin and overthrew him in April 1979. But that also came at a tremendous price. It cost Tanzania $500 million, which is a very substantial sum in a country like Tanzania. So the economy was virtually on the verge of collapse, with lack of spare parts and products for the factories and for the agricultural sector as well. So in 1979, Nyerere's Minister of Finance, Edwin Mtei, MTEI, approached him and said, we have no choice really but to deal with the IMF. And what did that entail? It would include a wage freeze. It would increase and it would include end of subsidies for education, for healthcare, and for food and for fuel. And obviously, it would also entail the devaluation of the Tanzanian shilling. And Nyerere said, devalue the Tanzanian shilling over my dead body. So he rejected that. And Edwin Mtei resigned as finance minister, even though Nyerere still recommended him. And he was hired as a managing director at the IMF. But Nyerere also saw the writing on the wall, and he realized that his own popularity, which had never been challenged in Tanzania, very extremely popular in Tanzania, throughout Africa, and internationally as well, that could be in danger. So he announced in 1980 that he would be serving his last presidential term. And he encouraged the promotion of a multi-party system because he had to travel around the country and he saw how the ruling party, CCM, had really ossified and atrophied. And he believed the only way it could be reinvigorated was by competition. But he said, I hope we end up with only two parties and that both of them are socialist and that they only differ in how to implement their socialist vision in Tanzania. Well, that is not the case today. Tanzania has a multiplicity of parties, even though CCM has still been the ruling party since the country won its independence. And he also said, multi-party cannot really mean much if it's just a matter of having multiple parties with no vision. And he gave the example of the United States, where he said, you have so-called multi-party system, but you really don't have an authentic opposition party, because both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are both imperialist and both are capitalist. So that's the other example he gave. So in 1985, Nyerere stepped down, and he was succeeded by Ali Hassan Mwinyi as the next president under the CCM party. And it was under President Mwinyi that Tanzania finally yielded and signed a deal with the IMF, which came with all those conditionalities, the so-called Washington consensus / structural adjustment. So that's now heading toward 1990. Nyerere finally stepped down as the ruling party chairman. After stepping down as president, he had remained as chairman rather, of CCM, the ruling party. So it is in this aspect of trying to create a socialist society in Tanzania that Nyerere faced his most tremendous challenge. So we look at his legacy. We can say his greatest achievement was in building a stable, united Tanzania, in seeing the total liberation of the rest of Africa from European colonial rule, and that at the end of the day, even though he embarked on a journey to create socialism in Tanzania in 1961, Tanzania, pretty much like every other African country, ended up in the trap ensnared by the World Bank, IMF, neoliberal Washington consensus structural adjustment trap. And that is where things stand today. In Tanzania, it's still one of the most stable countries in Africa, thanks to the legacy of Julius Nyerere. I want to now make some suggestions as reference. The first is the book, Julius Nyerere by Paul Bjerk. Last name is spelled Bjerk.